All right, welcome back. Another Gamecock Central roster breakdown. I'm Wes Mitchell. He is Chris Clark. And today we're talking tight ends. Chris, an interesting position for South Carolina, I think. We were just talking about it before we started recording. Lots of bodies. I think some talent at the position, some different skill sets maybe if you start to look through the guys. I think if you're going to talk tight ends, though, you sort of have to start with Nick Muse. He's a guy obviously came in as a transfer, was able to get immediately eligible even after, I guess, missing a game there at the beginning, was able to get eligible and played a lot for South Carolina alongside Kyle Markway last year. Had the injury, was expected to be back full go this year. And, I think is clearly your most experienced threat is more of a receiver at that position, I think. Has some athleticism, and really should be in a position to be the main guy at tight end. And we'll get to some of those other guys and what it's going to mean for them. I think you have an all-out battle for playing time outside of Nick Muse, but certainly I think Nick is sort of your most proven commodity in this group, and probably is not really going to be someone that is talked about a ton. But when you look at all the questions at receiver that we've talked about, I think having a good receiving threat at tight end that I think Nick Muse can provide could be a big part of this offense this year.
Yeah, it certainly could. And I think that is a guy, honestly, just having some conversations with people around and familiar with the program. Nick Muse has come up a lot in the past few weeks in terms of, hey, he's a guy that's going to help. He's a guy that's going to be a significant part. And when you talk to people, familiar with this program around it, about sort of the outlook, about how things are going, if you're trying to assess the offense, get sort of some thoughts and some feedback on how it could go in year one of Mike Bobo at South Carolina, it's sort of, hey, Nick Muse is back. And so I found that interesting that, you hear it in the same breath as, well, Ryan Helinski had a good spring and offensive line, they like some pieces there, et cetera. And you always hear Nick Muse in that same breath. And so I think the expectations from this staff, at least, are pretty high for him. He's a field stretcher. He's got size. We saw some glimpses of what he could do last year. He to be a little bit more consistent, whether it's catching. He had, a fumble in a game. It took him some time, I think, to get acclimated. But he has the ability to even make guys miss in the open field for a big guy and probably has NFL potential, Wes. So he's a guy they're excited about. Beyond him, like you said, lots of bodies. There are some talented bodies, whether they're already on campus or they're coming in, but just sort of lean on experience. But Nick, I think, is the guy that they're counting on to sort of lead this group.
Yeah, that's a spot where, I think you feel really good about Nick. And if I look back to some of these Bobo offenses at Georgia, I remember Georgia traditionally having really good tight ends. And I think he'll be used within this offense. Now, the other thing, we've heard this in recruiting, of course, with South Carolina prioritizing someone like Robbie Oots, but let's apply it to the current roster, is that this scheme is going to require an inline tight end that can actually set the edge, that can block, that can be a more traditional old-school tight end at times as well. So I think when we sort of try to break down this position, how we feel about it, it starts with Nick Muse, and he's up here. I think you at least have a good idea what you're going to get out of him. Then, we had to write it down because there's so many guys and there's so many different skill sets. I would look at, in one category, you have, and I think we talked about Adam Prentice a bit when we talked about running backs, but he maybe falls into that category as being someone who can be a blocking type guy for you. But he's not that big. He's not that 6'5", 260-pound tight end that can get on the edge and block a defensive end necessarily. So we'll see. But also in that category, more of a blocker, South Carolina obviously played Chandler Farrell at tight end some last year. And he was more of a blocking tight end. Obviously, we think that we didn't dream that he may have played some fullback this spring as well, or lined up in the backfield some. just in some of the drills we got to see. We may have made that up, honestly. But we had a what's it called? It was a shared experience. We both believe that we saw that. So I'm going to say that it happened.
It's a group hallucination, yes.
Yes. Okay, so Adam Prentice, Chandler Farrell, Will Register falls in that category as well. Maybe new life for Will Register to sort of get a chance to fit in there in that position. Then you have a number of guys that are either, I believe, more receiving threats or more maybe could do both. I put Keyshawn Toney kind of in the category of could, be kind of a dual threat guy, could do both. Trey Kenyon, we saw him in camp a couple years ago. Just, for that particular moment, the dude looked like Alshon Jeffrey in camp. I'm not saying he's Alshon Jeffrey, obviously, but ball skills were off the charts. Can that translate? Kevion Mullins, who I had almost completely forgotten, transferred over from receiver to tight end this spring. What does he do? Then I think the real wild cards here, Eric Shaw, who anybody who really knows football will tell you is probably one of the best prospects they signed, regardless of whether he's like a 4 or 5 star guy. He's not in the stratosphere as like a Marshawn Lloyd or a Jordan Burch on the ranking side of things. But as far as talent, everybody just brags on what this guy's going to be capable of, whether it's at tight end or on the defensive side of the ball. Then you got Jaheim Bell, who I think listened to Mike Bobo talk. He's excited about the possibility to move Jaheim Bell around. Now, does Jaheim Bell, at least early in his career, end up more out on the perimeter as like a big almost receiver? If you look at Bobo's offense, he does sort of shift guys around quite a bit. You'll see some more H-back size guys sometimes out on the edge, either blocking in the screen game or, going downfield for passes. So to me, there's a lot to work with. There's talent, but there's a lot to sort through as well. And you just sort of, if you're South Carolina, if you're Bobby Bentley taking back over the tight ends after a brief pause to go back to running backs, you're sort of looking at this group and saying, I need for the cream to rise to the top. As you and I sit here, I feel, Chris, it's very hard to predict past Nick Muse which guy that might actually be.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think Eric Shaw is one of the better prospects on the team, like in general. When you're talking about upside guys, pro potential to be, an all SEC type of guy, he's just got everything you look for, whether it's size, the measurables, the athleticism, the versatility. He's got all those things. And I think Shaw and Bell, there's a lot of excitement in the program about what those guys can bring. I think they're going to push some of these older guys immediately. Jaheim Bell is really both of them, but Jaheim Bell's really interesting because he could really play receiver probably for you. And so he almost reminds me a little bit of, one time at Georgia, Mike Bobo had Orson Charles, you remember, who was, a 6'2" or so guy. He's even played some fullback in the NFL now. And he could line up as they would put Aaron White, who was a bigger tight end, and Orson Charles out there, and they could shift around. And it was tough for defenses to tell if they were in a 2 tight end look or an H-back look or a 3 wide. They could do some different things formationally to where it was difficult to understand what exactly those guys were going to do. So I think Jaheim Bell falls into that sort of role in the future. Will it be this season? I don't know. I think he has the ability to see some time. Shaw's got a huge upside, but you're right. There's a lot of bodies here and some guys that are talented, and there are different roles where Adam Prentice, as opposed to being more of a straight inline tight end, he's probably more of an H-back or a fullback. If they use Chandler Farrell, he's probably more of a blocking fullback type guy. Toney can do some of both. I think he's shown some things as a blocker, and he's not going to athletically be in the mold of a Shaw or a Bell, for example, or even a Kenyon, but he can, he has good hands. He is a good route runner. He just athletically isn't, maybe in that same universe as some of those other guys. So a lot of intriguing pieces there. It's just really, this is one of the positions that it's hardest to figure out beyond, hey, Nick Muse is probably going to be your starter. How does the rest of it shake out? And it's honestly one of the hardest ones to peg on the team.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, man, from everything we see, and stuff that we're not going to see is the summer workouts. Once they're able to get back and actually get on the field and get back in the weight room, which of these guys just sort of take this opportunity and outwork the guy next to him is a good head start, and that's something we have no idea which one of these guys is most driven right now to be the guy. And the other part, who's picked it up mentally, if it's close and if it's somewhat close to a tie almost, coaches are always going to go with the guy they trust more mentally, who knows the scheme better, knows the playbook, knows what they're supposed to do. They may have an idea right now, or at least an inkling of which way it's going. I just think it's really hard for us to sit here and say, although just listening to Bobo talk, to me, it really sounded like if the two freshmen can get themselves acclimated quickly, then I think there's a place for both ththese guys to get out there and play. And like you said, Jaheim Bell, with the shortage at receiver, maybe he's on the field. Maybe it's not quite traditionally what we call a tight end. There's some, I like the Orson Charles comparison. To make it a South Carolina comparison, there's some Casey Crosby aspects here as far as how Carolina used him, I think. And, it should be interesting. It'll be one of the more interesting battles. Trey Kenyon was a guy we were really high on, and he got pushed back from being able to come in early. There was some stuff there, and then I think he was banged up last year and just sort of didn't get off to that quick start, but still, just a redshirt freshman. So and the other side, some of the Shrine Bowl coaches that I'm friends with from last year were very impressed with Keyshawn Toney and sort of some of the things he could do. So Bobby Bentley's got a lot of guys to work with. Does Will Muschamp steal Eric Shaw and place him on the defensive side of the ball? It's probably as big of a question as any, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, certainly. And I think for Carolina, the good news, they have a couple guys there because Shaw would project as that buck type, right? So I think the good news is, there's some questions with losing DJ Wanham there, but they have Brad Johnson, a guy that's been around. They have Rod Fitton who can play there. Maybe they give somebody else a look. The good news is they signed Jordan Birch, and he's got a chance to be a really good player. So if you look either short or long-term need, it's not maybe like the situation's dire to where you feel like, we need to play Eric on defense. But for a defensive-minded coach, you're going to look at what Eric Shaw can do, what he did in the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star game, what he did in his senior year out of Reeltown on tape. Man, he's impressive. And so it's probably going to be a battle. And I know we've both heard, Wes, that behind the scenes there's been some joking back and forth between these staffs about who's going to be able to steal Eric Shaw. And it may end up being a battle, and maybe it's just where he's needed the most. But I think he's got like I said, I'll sort of double down on what I said earlier. He's got a huge upside wherever he plays. And I think, you look at the hand size. That was one thing that stood out. We mentioned this before on the site. If you go back and look at Eric Shaw, where his hand size compares to NFL drafted tight ends from last year's draft. I didn't go back and look at these, but the 2019 draft, I think he had bigger hands than maybe all but one of the tight ends that went in the first two rounds. So, he's already got like NFL measurables in terms of just height, hand size, all those things. And obviously he can really move, and he's going to continue filling out. So there's a lot to like.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there with that. I was going to bring that up. So hand size is something that sometimes people roll their eyes when they see that on the NFL Combine list of things that they measure. But we were talking – I don't remember where we got this from. I think you got this from somebody. But there's a certain point where if a guy has a hand size of a certain length, most of those guys just statistically are super athletic.
Yep.
And do you remember what sort of the cutoff is for that?
I think it's about 11, close to 11 or so, because I think that's about where Eric Shaw's at. One example that was given to us, Wes, is, Matt Stafford at Georgia. He's not a wide receiver, He's a quarterback, and hand size does. There's more evidence of that too. That hand size plays into your ability to throw a foot. That's why you and I aren't elite. Sorry, at throwing footballs. We're shorter guys. Yeah, we don't have huge hands, and so that affects your ability. If you have, oven mitts for hands, your ability to throw a ball, it's not the end all be all, but it's going to be easier for you. You have a higher upside doing it. So Stafford just obviously you see some of the things he can do throwing the ball. He's freaky, and so that was one example that was given to us. But when you look at tight ends or even wide receivers, bigger hands, Deebo Samuel, he has bigger hands than most 6'4" receivers, but his is abnormal for his size. I can't remember he's like 10 and a half, 10 and 3/4. It's absurd. And so for whatever reason, just genetically, you're exactly right. That was the example that was given to us.
Yeah, big hands. You and I we're screwed on this one, but yeah, if you got big hands, you're probably pretty athletic. So, and I had never, until somebody had told us that fairly recently, I had never really put two and two together. You assume a wide receiver, the assumption is the bigger hands, the easier it is to catch football, but there's actually some statistical analysis that goes along with that as well. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up on the tight ends. You got anything else to add, Chris? I think the overall, like we said in the very beginning, the final thought here for me is just it's Nick Muse, and then, hey, who else can step up? I think you feel good about somebody stepping up, predicting it. Hopefully we know more in the fall.
Yeah, and tight end, a key role maybe. There are some questions at wide receiver, Wes, and maybe some guys step up, and they're going to need some guys to step up at tight end as well. Nick Muse isn't a finished product by any means, but we've seen, Mike Bobo's offense is so versatile, and schematically he can do a lot of different things, whether it's 4 wide and H-back, 2 tight ends, I formation. There's a lot of different things he can do, and so the staff's still trying to figure out what can these players do best, what's best for us, in terms of philosophy and week to week. And so I think they're going to have some flexibility there. And maybe if some tight ends can step up, it helps alleviate, some of that pressure and finding, wide receivers that can give them what they need.
Definitely. All right. Good stuff, Chris. For Chris Clark, I'm Wes Mitchell on Gamecock Central. Be sure to subscribe and check out GamecockCentral.com as well. We've got a free trial going right now with the promotional code Gamecocks2020. We'll get you a free trial on GamecockCentral.com from now until August 1. Chris, I'm Wes. We'll talk to you next time.